Well, an update now to a story we've been watching. The operator of a cargo ship seized by Iranian forces say it's been released and the crew appears to be fine. The Maersk Tigris will now continue its voyage to the UAE. Iran seized the vessel last week in the Strait of Hormuz, claiming the Danish shipping company chartering it owed money to an Iranian firm. This is all happening as Congress takes the next step towards approving legislation for oversight of a potential nuclear deal. Let's bring in now Gillian Turner, former member of the National Security Council during the Bush and Obama administrations and a Fox News contributor. So, Gillian, you see this event that we've been watching, the seizure of this cargo ship taking place over the last week or so. Now that the ship is underway, what's our takeaway from it? What do you think? What do we learn from this?
The big picture is that Iran is taking advantage of a pause in the nuclear negotiations with the United States to really execute a series of hostile actions to test President Obama's resolve. There's been interventions off the coast of Yemen and in the Straits of Hormuz. There was the arrest and imprisonment of an American journalist on trumped-up charges, and just the day before yesterday, Houthi rebels in Yemen, backed by Iran, launched an incursion into Saudi Arabia. So these are really strong indicators of where the Iranian regime is right now in terms of dealing with the West and with the United States.
So if it is a test, how are we doing? Can you grade us?
Well, there's this bizarre foreign policy scenario right now where we are facing the Iranian regime across a negotiating table in one part of the world and literally across a battlefield in another. The White House is very confident they can navigate both of these scenarios without sacrificing any U.S. national security interests. The United States Congress, as you know, is not so confident, and they've now introduced this kind of test bill, which is intended to check the president's resolve.
And let's talk a little bit about that bill. There's going to be a procedural vote a little later on today, and the Senate is expected to come to a full vote next week. It also is expected that the president will sign this. That would give Congress some oversight to the nuclear deal if there is one, which is a big if still at this point. What do you think of the legislation as you see it so far? Does that give our representatives enough oversight?
Well, I think it's really the Congress inserting themselves into the foreign policy making process, which is traditionally the president's prerogative. I think that what they're attempting to do here is really make sure that in his eagerness to sign, seal, and deliver a bill by the June 30th deadline, which, by the way, as we all know, is somewhat arbitrary, the president doesn't sort of misstep or at any point along the way sacrifice U.S. national security interests. That's the primary fear of members on the Hill who are focused on national security and foreign policy issues. So what we have to see here is how much power this bill actually gives them, and I think after the vote today we'll really get a better sense of that.
And that'll be interesting because the president said if there's any major changes to the bill or anything unexpected, he may not sign it, and that would lead us down a different road. So we'll leave it there for a second to see what actually happens today, Gillian. I want to ask you about something that you mentioned just a few moments ago, which is that here we're in this kind of bizarre scenario. We're negotiating with the Iranians across the table on one hand, and on the other, we have some real national security concerns. And then yesterday, we did an interview with a human rights activist who we asked this question about divorcing the human rights violations of Iran from them as a potential nuclear power. And here's what he had to say about the wisdom in that.
The best barometer of how a country will treat its neighbors in the world is, I think, how that government treats its own people. And by that measure, a country which doesn't trust you to paint a picture, to sing a song, or to make a joke, or to go to a protest, we should seriously rethink how much that government can be trusted.
So that's one point of view. Gillian, there are those that say, listen, we've negotiated with evil actors before. If Iran's evil, we can do it again. Just similarly, if they act out the way that they have over the last several weeks, we can also handle that. What do you think, again, of the wisdom moving ahead into these nuclear negotiations with some of these lingering issues still?
Well, the Obama administration, is attempting to do something very tricky here, and that is to really silo the issues related to economic sanctions and the nuclear negotiations and all the other issues we've got with Iran. One of those important issues being their tremendous human rights violations. Traditionally, this is something that we deal with through State Department channels. along with this negotiation, what the administration says is going to happen, that if we ink a nuclear deal, we're going to remove some economic sanctions, but none of the human rights related sanctions and penalties that are imposed upon Iran are going to be part of that package. This is a very tricky thing to do because it's not at all clear that the sanctions regime we've crafted so carefully over the past decade really delineates these clearly. So even if a deal is inked, it's going to be very tricky to try and tell which sanctions we're supposed to remove and which should remain in place.
So what do you think about that, Gillian? Again, looking ahead into what's best for the country, should the issues be put into the pot together, and should this be part of one big negotiation with Iran to bring them into the quote-unquote the world community and really have them as, I hesitate to use the word partner, but to have them as an actor on that stage? Or is it best to deal with it all separately?
I personally believe that dealing with Iran in a holistic manner, whole of government to whole of government, is the best approach for our national security interests. I think that ignoring to any extent the fact that they've had these tremendous human rights abuses over the past few decades is something that's potentially dangerous, not only for them, but for us as well. I think that exposing them to sort of potential opportunities for relief from economic sanctions is also going to spur a lot of sort of false posturing, where they're going to pretend that they're doing a better job and try and cover things up along the way. It's a big risk.
Gillian, nice to have your insights today. It's obviously a big topic and a lot to keep our eye on, but an important one. Thank you so much for the time.